Have you ever wondered about the real story behind Snow White, the fairy tale that has captivated us for generations? It's a tale far deeper and more intricate than you might remember, filled with wishes, jealousy, and the enduring power of kindness. Let's journey back to a kingdom long ago, where it all began with a queen's simple, heartfelt wish. Once upon a time, in the dead of winter, a queen sat sewing by a window with a frame of black ebony. As she worked, she pricked her finger, and 3 drops of blood fell onto the pure white snow. The contrast was so striking: red as blood, white as snow, and black as the ebony frame. She thought to herself, "Oh, how I wish I had a daughter with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony." Soon after, the queen's wish came true. She gave birth to a beautiful baby girl who was named Snow White for her snowy skin. But tragically, the queen passed away shortly after her daughter's birth. The king, after a year, took a new wife. This new queen was breathtakingly beautiful, but her heart was filled with pride and vanity. She owned a magical mirror, and every day she would stand before it and ask, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And every day the mirror would reply, "You, my queen, are the fairest of them all." This answer satisfied her, as she knew the mirror always spoke the truth. But Snow White was growing up, and with each passing year her beauty blossomed. She became more and more lovely, until one day, when she was 7 years old, the queen asked her usual question to the mirror. This time the answer was different. The mirror replied, "My queen, you are fair, it is true. But Snow White is 1,000 times fairer than you." The queen was shocked, and her heart turned green with envy. From that moment on, her jealousy grew into a burning hatred for her innocent stepdaughter. She could no longer bear the sight of Snow White. Her obsession consumed her, until finally she summoned a huntsman and gave him a terrible order. "Take the child away into the forest," she commanded. "I never want to see her again. You must kill her, and as proof, bring me back her lungs and liver." The huntsman, though loyal, had a good heart. He led Snow White deep into the woods, but when he drew his knife to carry out the queen's wicked plan, he couldn't do it. Snow White, seeing the weapon, began to weep. "Oh, dear huntsman," she pleaded, "spare my life. I will run into the wild forest and never come home again." Her beauty and innocence moved the huntsman to pity. "Run away then, you poor child," he said, thinking that the wild beasts of the forest would surely devour her soon anyway. He felt a great weight lift from his shoulders for not having to stain his hands with her blood. To deceive the queen, he killed a young boar and brought its lungs and liver back to the castle. The wicked queen, believing it was Snow White, had them cooked in salt and ate them, convinced she had finally eliminated her rival. Now, poor Snow White was all alone in the vast, dark forest. She was terrified. She ran as far as her feet could carry her, over sharp stones and through thorny bushes. Wild animals passed her by, but none harmed her. She ran and ran until evening fell, just as she stumbled upon a small cottage. Exhausted, she decided to go inside to rest. Everything inside the cottage was tiny but immaculately neat. There was a little table covered with a white cloth, set with 7 little plates, 7 little spoons, 7 little knives and forks, and 7 little mugs. Against the wall stood 7 little beds, all in a row, covered with pristine white quilts. Snow White was desperately hungry and thirsty, so she took a tiny bite of vegetables and a little piece of bread from each plate and a small sip of wine from each mug. She didn't want to take everything from just one place. Afterward, feeling incredibly sleepy, she tried to find a bed that fit. She lay down in one after another, but none were quite right. One was too long, another too short. Finally, the 7th one was just perfect. She snuggled in, said her prayers, and fell fast asleep. When it was fully dark, the owners of the cottage returned. They were the 7 dwarfs who spent their days mining for or in the mountains. As they lit their 7 little candles, they immediately noticed that someone had been there. The first one said, "Who has been sitting in my chair?" The second, "Who has been eating from my plate?" The third, "Who has been taking my bread?" The fourth, "Who has been eating my vegetables?" The fifth, "Who has been using my fork?" The sixth, "Who has been cutting with my knife?" And the 7th, "Who has been drinking from my mug?" Then the first dwarf looked at his bed and saw a little hollow in it. "Who has been in my bed?" he cried. The others ran to their beds and exclaimed, "Someone has been in our beds too." But when the 7th dwarf looked at his bed, he saw the sleeping Snow White. He called the others, and they all gathered around, holding their candles high. They were astonished by her beauty. "Oh heavens, what a lovely child," they whispered. They were so enchanted that they didn't wake her, and the 7th dwarf let her sleep in his bed, while he spent an hour with each of his companions to get through the night. The next morning, Snow White woke up and was frightened to see the 7 dwarfs staring at her, but they were very friendly and asked, "What is your name?" "My name is Snow White," she replied. "How did you find your way to our house?" the dwarfs asked. So she told them her whole story about her wicked stepmother who wanted her killed, the huntsman who spared her life, and how she had run all day until she found their cottage. The dwarfs listened with sympathy. When she finished, they said, "If you will keep house for us, cook, make the beds, wash, sew, and knit, and keep everything clean and orderly, then you can stay with us, and you will want for nothing." "Yes," said Snow White, "with all my heart." And so she stayed with them and kept their little house in perfect order. Every morning, the dwarfs went off to the mountains to dig for gold and copper. And in the evening they would return, and their dinner would be ready. But during the day, the girl was all alone. The good dwarfs were worried and warned her to be careful. "Beware of your stepmother," they said. "She will soon find out you are here. Be sure not to let anyone in." Meanwhile, back at the castle, the queen, believing she was once again the most beautiful woman in the land, went to her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" To her horror, the mirror answered, "My queen, you are fair, it is true. But Snow White, beyond the mountains with the 7 dwarfs, is still 1,000 times fairer than you." The queen trembled with rage. She knew the mirror never lied, and she realized the huntsman had deceived her. Now she began to plot a new and even more wicked way to get rid of Snow White. Her vanity would not allow her to have any rival. So she disguised herself as an old peddler woman, painting her face and changing her clothes so she was completely unrecognizable. In this disguise, she crossed the 7 mountains to the 7 Dwarfs' cottage. She knocked on the door and called out, "Pretty things for sale, pretty things for sale." Snow White peeked out the window and said, "Good day, good woman. What do you have to sell?" "Good things, pretty things," the old woman replied. Bodice laces of all colors. She held up one made of bright, colorful silk. "I can let this honest woman in," thought Snow White. She unbolted the door and bought the pretty lace. "Child," said the old woman, "come, let me lace you up properly for once." The unsuspecting Snow White stood before her and let the old woman thread the new lace. But the queen laced so quickly and so tightly that Snow White couldn't breathe. She fell to the ground, appearing to be lifeless. "Now I am the fairest at last," the queen said to herself and hurried away. Not long after, the 7 dwarfs returned home. They were horrified to find their dear Snow White lying on the floor, motionless. They lifted her up, and seeing that she was laced too tightly, they quickly cut the bodice lace in two. She began to breathe a little, and slowly she came back to life. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was no one else but the wicked queen. You must be more careful and not let anyone in when we are not here." Back at the castle, the evil queen rushed to her mirror and asked her familiar question. She was confident, but the mirror once again replied, "My queen, you are fair, it is true. But Snow White, beyond the mountains with the 7 dwarfs, is still 1,000 times fairer than you." When she heard this, all her blood rushed to her heart in shock, for she realized Snow White was alive again. "Now," she said, "I will think of something that will be your utter ruin." Using her knowledge of witchcraft, she crafted a poisoned comb. Then she disguised herself again, this time as a different old woman. She crossed the 7 mountains and knocked on the dwarf's door, calling out, "Good things for sale, good things for sale." Snow White looked out and said, "Go away, I cannot let anyone in." "You can at least look," said the old woman, and she held up the poisoned comb. It looked so beautiful that Snow White was tempted. She opened the door. After they agreed on a price, the old woman said, "Now let me comb your hair properly for you." Poor Snow White, suspecting nothing, let her do it. But the moment the comb touched her hair, the poison took effect, and she fell down without any sign of life. "You paragon of beauty," said the wicked woman, "now you are done for." And she left. Luckily, evening came quickly, and the 7 dwarfs returned. When they saw Snow White lying on the ground, they immediately suspected the queen. They searched and found the poisoned comb. As soon as they pulled it out of her hair, Snow White revived and told them what had happened. They warned her once more to be on her guard and to open the door to no one. The queen, at home, went to her mirror and received the same infuriating answer for a 3rd time. She began to tremble and shake with rage. "Snow White shall die," she shrieked, "even if it costs me my own life." She went into a secret, solitary room where no one ever entered, and there she made a poisonous apple. On the outside, it was beautiful white, with a rosy red cheek, so tempting that anyone who saw it would want it, but whoever ate even a tiny piece of it would surely die. When the apple was ready, she painted her face and disguised herself as a peasant woman. And so she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs. She knocked Snow White, put her head out of the window and said, "I cannot let anyone in. The 7 dwarfs have forbidden it." "It's all the same to me," answered the woman. "I'll soon be rid of my apples. Here, I'll give you one." "No," said Snow White, "I dare not take anything." "Are you afraid of poison?" asked the old woman. "Look, I'll cut the apple in 2. You eat the red cheek, and I'll eat the white." The apple was so cunningly made that only the red side was poisoned. Snow White longed for the beautiful apple, and when she saw the peasant woman eating part of it, she could resist no longer. She reached out her hand and took the poisoned half, but hardly had she a bite in her mouth than she fell down dead. The queen looked at her with a triumphant, cruel gaze and laughed aloud. "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony wood," she cackled. "This time the dwarves won't be able to wake you up." And when she got home and asked her mirror, it finally answered, "You, my queen, are the fairest of them all." At last her envious heart had peace, as much as an envious heart can ever have peace. When the dwarfs came home that evening, they found Snow White lying on the ground. She was not breathing at all. She was dead. They lifted her up, looked to see if they could find anything poisonous, unlaced her, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine, but it was no use. The dear child was dead, and she remained dead. They laid her on a bier, and all 7 of them sat around it and mourned for her for 3 whole days. They were going to bury her, but she still looked as fresh as a living person and still had her beautiful rosy cheeks. They said, "We cannot bury her in the dark ground." So they had a transparent coffin of glass made, so that she could be seen from all sides. They laid her inside and wrote her name on it in golden letters, and that she was a king's daughter. Then they put the coffin out on the mountain, and one of them always stayed by it and watched over it. And the birds came too and mourned for Snow White. First an owl, then a raven, and last a dove. For a long, long time Snow White lay in the coffin, and she did not change, but looked as if she were asleep. Then one day a prince happened to ride through the forest and came to the dwarf's house, seeking shelter for the night. He saw the coffin on the mountain, with the beautiful Snow White inside.